All right, so yeah, thanks so much for coming. This is the first speaker session that we're doing. It's really exciting to have all of you guys here today. I want to thank Christian for producing this event, as well as our sponsors AMD, of course the Village, and the whole crew there, as well as the entire VRLA team. So before we start, I just want to talk briefly about the format of today's event. We're going to be doing a panel for about an hour, and then a Q&A for about half an hour after that. And if you want to stick around and meet each other, you're more than welcome to do so. So I would like to introduce our awesome set of speakers today. To my left, or your right, we have James Iliff, co-founder and chief creative officer of Servios. James was friends with Palmer Luckey when he was created the Rift, and it was actually one of the first guys that I met in VR a few years ago, and an all-around awesome person. To his right, we have Brett Leonard, writer, director, and producer. Most notably wrote and directed the cult classic The Lawnmower Man, as I'm sure you guys are familiar with, in '92. And you also might recognize him as a clown performer in Killer Clowns from Outer Space.
There's a story behind that.
And I totally did not just look up your IMDb last night.
It's true.
That was a good movie. To his right, we have Samantha Matthews, co-founder and chief executive officer of Venn Agency, a startup dedicated to weaving art and technology into our everyday life. And she was also a DJ, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. And to her right, we have Kevin Mack, who co-founded Shapespace VR. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with that, but it's this really cool kind of trippy art experience. You're moving through these weird, like blobby, colorful shapes. He's also an Academy Award-winning artist, and he won an Oscar for the best visual effects for What Dreams May Come. And also, you're involved with neuroscience, right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes. Although I'm inhibited from doing any kind of surgery.
I'm not going to ask why.
They made that very
Yeah, please use your mic, though. Mic. All right, great. So let's get into it. All right, you guys ready? You caffeinated?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Awesome. So I want to start with talking about sort of just like generally like hardware. Today we have pretty lightweight HMDs. The Rift you can barely feel on your head. What do you think the hardware in terms of for VR will look like in 100 years from now? Will we be still walking into our walls, or will we be spinning around in giant gyroscopes? Or at that point, will we have some kind of like brain implant?
I'm going to go with the giant gyroscopes on that one. I think this guy nailed it. It's going to be giant gyros.
They just look cool.
They do look cool.
I walked into a door on my way here with my own eyes, so I'm not so sure we're going to stop walking into doors. But I think things will be ubiquitous. Computing will be, everything will have a computer in it. I don't foresee us having necessarily head-mounted displays, unless I think like anything, we still have AM radios. I was listening to the future of VR on my AM radio, CBC Canada, driving in my Westphalia from the 80s, and I was like, well, I think that things won't ever disappear. Like, I think we'll still want to be fully immersed in certain situations, but that everything around us will be like connected and intelligent.
I'm not sure. I'm going to go the other direction. I'm not sure that we're going to have bodies in 100 years. My friend Ray Kurzweil would talk about that a bit, and I just have a feeling that the curve of change is going to be something that has a horizon factor we can't even begin to imagine. And the truth is, for me, and this is apropos to the title of this panel, is that VR and all of these technologies are actually an instinctual drive of the soul of the species to create what is already going on. We're already in a virtual reality. And we are, matter of fact, just 3 days ago, a quantum physicist came out with the idea that there is no actual solid reality. This is literally like one of the top quantum physicists in the world who said it was, taking the Schrodinger's cat equation to its logical conclusion, and the idea of, uncertainty, and the idea that there is not only particle duality, but particle non-existence. It's all just the perspective of consciousness. And when you get empirical particle scientists saying that, it's a pretty interesting time.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of radical, but why hinder ourselves to simply a discussion of VR peripherals? I mean, if we're talking hundreds of years, it's very clear there could be some radical changes. There's a lot of stuff happening with physics now. I mean, I've heard a lot of stuff that people might label it quantum mysticism, and there's some there's valid points on both sides. But if you're talking in 100 years or hundreds of years, I mean, there might be digitized consciousness. We might have a fundamentally different understanding of what it actually means to be human in the first place. We might realize that we're all just moving around in these weird puppet meat bodies, and that we actually have a lot more inherent abilities than we actually thought we did. And
exactly.
So who knows? Like, there could be some really trippy shit that
we're
happens.
all swapping molecules right now.
Right,
completely. So the idea of boundaries is actually very illusionary. And so I believe that VR is a transformative medium designed, since we're going to talk this, 100-year stuff, so I'm going to go completely out there.
Please, that's why we're here.
It's really designed as our dendrites are reaching out for each other in a different way, and I believe that there's a new kind of essentially Homo sapien that's coming along that is going to be connected to, even if I look at cinema is, which has been my religion until VR, is kind of an instinctual drive to just see what reality is in this kind of strange cucuform symbol form, that is a stylized form. Now we're getting back to non-stylized forms of experience, because really virtual reality is tremendously, it can be stylized, but it's ultimately completely experiential. I suggest everyone go back and reread, if you haven't read it, or if you haven't read it, Marshall McLuhan's Media Extensions of Man, which he wrote in 1964, which is completely impenetrable at that time. Now, he was literally writing for the moment we're in right now.
Oh, wow.
And it's like all the things he talks about are related to this moment where we're transitioning into a virtual environment as a way of communicating with each other. It's very interesting.
It seems like there is a certain physicalness to it as well. Like the most enjoyable experiences I found are, at least in the present day technology, are things that are very active that you do. There's something about physically moving around and engaging that is exciting. So whether or not you actually have a body anymore, there's something there that there's, like people say right now that Sword Art Online, for those who have seen it, the anime, where it's kind of like the Matrix. You're sitting in a bed, you put your uplink on or whatever, and you kind of get beamed into the virtual world, and you're thinking everything, and it feels like reality. But depending on how long it takes to get to a technology like that, I sort of question the how compelling it is to lay down and experience VR versus moving around physically with my body in VR. Unless the interface actually makes my brain think I'm physical, but until we get to that point, I'm going to prefer something physical.
How many of you have had the experience of synesthesia in VR? Because I'm starting to experience that more and more. It's almost like the brain gets trained by being in VR, and there was a demo where there were multiple doors. It was untethered, so I was able to walk around a fairly large space and look through different portals, and there was rain or static in the portal between me and the next space. And as my arm reached through it, I felt the rain or the static on my arm every time exactly. And the more I did it, the more my brain told me that was there. There's been a lot of experiments where people with virtual food. Have you heard about these? Okay, where people go in and eat virtual food, and they taste it, and they've done brain measurement where they see the taste centers being stimulated. So this idea of having a physical experience in VR, I think, is actually closer than we could possibly imagine, especially as resolution and transport, all the things that we're battling on the technical front get better and better and better. These boundaries will start to dissolve.
Kevin, you had something to add?
Oh, just that I think that the nature of all this, where it goes in 100 years, is somewhere along the way. I think that the whole thing about virtual reality is it reveals the illusion. It will ultimately make us realize that the reality we've believed in all this time is an illusion to begin with, is a virtual reality. And,
Are you here right now, Kevin?
No.
Where are we?
No.
Actually, I was busy, so this is a partial personality that I'm projecting. But of course, no, none of us are here. Nothing is here. Reality is woven from nothingness. It is consciousness and void are isomorphic. They are the same thing.
And again, this was things that mystics talked about for years, and now particle physicists are talking the same language and measuring it. How many of you read about the measurement of gravity waves? Okay, do you understand how frickin' crazy that is? That it's a couple weeks ago. Yeah. It is, Einstein's theorem is proved. Okay, that's really nuts. And then when you can measure something, you can move towards controlling it. So the idea of gravity, the idea of space-time, dark matter, all these things start to actually come into focus as manipulable objects. And so VR, in essence, I believe is a form of us being able to grok this stuff, to be able to see that kind of data and experience it emotionally and physically, because that kind of data visualization is going to be the only way that scientists can actually move to the next level of understanding. I was up at JPL just a few weeks ago, and that's totally what they're grappling with, is how to visualize this crazy level of data analysis, and they're playing with forming virtual worlds to do that. So it's interesting.
Awesome. So here's a trippy question for you guys. If the goal of virtual reality is to fool you into believing you're somewhere else, we're going to want to simulate all 5 of our senses, things like touch, smell, maybe even taste. It seems like one thing that would be left out for a while would be pain. And if you think about it, pain would have to be deliberately programmed into an application. And I'm talking about, at the point where we have some kind of brain implant where we're able to completely trick all aspects of our body. So the question is, do you think we'll ever come to program pain into virtual reality? And if not, what would it mean to have a life without it?
I'm much more into programming pleasure into virtual reality, personally speaking.
I think we already do that. I think the fact that we have mirror neurons, that our brains have been adopting virtual reality for about 80,000 years. We adopt somebody else's point of view. The only thing separating me from you is a layer of skin that's telling me that I'm not you. So if somebody's grabbing my arm and I don't feel my arm, then, if somebody's grabbing your arm and I don't feel my arm, I feel that. And I mean, we all know about phantom limbs and everything like that. So I don't see how, if it's taken us 80,000 years and the same subset of neurons is 20% are firing to feel sympathy or empathy or anything like this, and then all of a sudden we're immersed in this virtual world, how many more, or what will that percentage of neurons increase to? How much more will we start to feel those things? You're talking about people tasting virtual food, you're talking about, I think that the nature of virtual reality is that it has all of these emotions already programmed into it, because this is what our brain does.
So true. I mean, all of that happens in the brain. It doesn't happen on our skin. It doesn't happen anywhere else. There's another experiment that's been done recently by a group of game designers, and I've been working with some game designers lately, which is a really interesting experience for narrative storytellers. It's really diving into the undiscovered country, let me tell you. But they did this thing where, these are radical, point of view shooter dudes who go into a virtual room, and there's a table, and on the table is a gun, a virtual gun, and there's a controller that represents that gun. And they walk in, and they're asked to pick up the gun, point it at their head, and pull the trigger. And these, radical gamer dudes are like, no problem, man, this is totally got this. 80% of them can't get it all the way to their head. They start to literally have an emotional breakdown. The ones that decide to be radical and show how gnarly they are, that pull the trigger, have PTSD nightmares for months on end from this one simple experience in virtual reality. And so the thing about this medium is that it is intimate. It is way more powerful than mediums before it. And one of the main things that I'm involved with as a storyteller is to set context for this medium, because talking about where we're going to be in 100 years, getting to that point is really what is the more interesting journey for all of us. And so recently I've written my 5 laws of VR, tongue-in-cheek, but it's a little bit of an homage to Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. It's in a fictional context, just like his was. I'm working on a show with a big HBO producer called The Futurist, which is going to have a VR component and a television component. And the lead character in that show, which is kind of a Steve Jobs of VR in a near future environment, has written these 5 laws. And the idea is to set an ethical framework, a moral ethical framework for a medium that's going to change children's brain chemistry and neuronic pathways. That is what this medium is going to be hitting very soon.
Is there a certain age that the children have to be?
Well, I mean, it does it to everybody.
Oh, okay.
It actually does. The brain research is showing. There's some people at NYU that have been doing this recently. There's some really amazing healing modalities happening in VR with PTSD. Some of you may have read about that, with soldiers with PTSD that have been. It's been working very well, because it literally has a greater effect on hardwiring neuronic pathways than reality does.
Well, the emotions are magnified times 10.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the stakes are high with this thing that we're playing with. It's not something that I want to make sure that we don't make the mistake that happened at the beginning of the Hollywood cinema period, which is, this is just entertainment. It doesn't mean anything. If you got a message, send it Western Union. That's what Harry Cohn, the great studio head, had said. And in a way, he's right from a storytelling standpoint. But we have to be aware that the stakes are high, and this is something. So my first law of VR is take VR seriously. Do not underestimate the ability of virtual reality to affect actual reality. So, and there's a number of them out there. But I really want this discussion to be part of it. And most of the young people that are involved with virtual reality of your generation kind of get this inherently, and that's very, very hopeful for someone like myself who's out there trying to mentor, because I think that we need to have the understanding that this is a transformative medium. It's tremendous healing potential and tremendous entertainment potential. I don't want censorship of any sort. All genres are welcome, but we do have to be aware of what is going to be created here. And we should not create greater alienation between human beings than we already have with our digital devices, but interconnectivity, that's one of the other laws. So and the kind of work that he is doing is exactly, to me, what this medium's meant to be about. And I think, even if that's in the context of interactive narrative or just as an abstract experience, there's just an amazing, ability to explore here, and I think that's got to drive this, especially at the beginning. Let's make sure at the beginning we push it in this direction, because it's going to be very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not anything to be trifled with either. I mean, you're absolutely right. I remember in the early days I was working in VR back in late 2010 and in 2011 at the Mixed Reality Lab, and they were doing military sim, and that's a lot of the projects I was working on back in the day. And I was familiar with a lot of the work that was going on, and there was PTSD treatment, there was training for combat. On both sides of wars, they have VR. And there's just some interesting implications there. I can't obviously speak to anything specific, but it was very apparent that VR was able to, well, let me just explain the experience. What PTSD VR trauma treatment is where you take someone who's experienced a traumatic incident, namely a soldier, something really traumatic like seeing a friend get blown up by a grenade or something horrible, and they interview them extensively, and then they recreate that experience in a virtual environment. And they use a process called systematic desensitization, where you have them experience that moment again and again and again until they don't feel anything anymore.
That's pain in VR.
And that's emotional pain, right? We're talking about pain. There's physical pain and there's emotional pain. That is a psychological treatment that is done with phobias. It's done with all kinds of things, and it works. And they found that this was able to get results in weeks, which was 5 times faster than the only other alternative, which was group therapy, which would take months and months, sometimes even years. Now, the downside of that is undetermined. Does that mean that that person is now insensitive to all things? Do they now have a lack of an understanding of violence in general? I don't know. Those things are never been measured completely. But
They're going to be.
The point remains is that it's nothing to be trifled with. It's very serious. And I say this coming from a guy who's making a combat action VR game.
You make a very violent
very
game.
violent. But we do it tastefully, and we're very aware of every choice we make. I can't say that for everything. But we're doing our best to toe that line.
I'm just going to put out, I think women should lead VR. And actually, that's starting to happen.
I'm not going to say that
it actually is starting to happen.
Guns and aggression aren't all that there is in VR. It's just the first thing we happen to be publishing. But there's a million other equally awesome and more awesome things to do than guns and violence. However, it's something that's entertaining that perhaps we need to figure out why humans like to do it.
It's engaging.
Exactly.
And the whole thing, the recent findings show that humans are unable, at least our brain, is unable to distinguish between positive and negative engagement. And we've evolved over, eons to be, very engaged by negative things. If somebody gets run over or eaten by a tiger, it's to our advantage to figure out, wow, why did that happen? We've got to obsess over these things in order to improve our chances of survival. But this is no longer the case, really. So I think we have to expand consciousness so that people can make the conscious decision to distinguish between positive and negative engagement. And on the PTSD thing, that they've shown that technique works, the whole reenacting thing. But what I'm trying to do with ShapeSpace is to be able to provide a transcendent experience that's so powerful and so enjoyable in and of itself that the other thing becomes irrelevant. It just washes it away with something with a sweeter taste. Instead of developing an insensitivity to it, it just makes it irrelevant.
It's kind of like a positive psychology as opposed to this sort of abnormal psych approach.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Well, the organizing principle of all civilization up to this point has been war. That is because it engages everything. And so we have to find other ways of engaging even more things. And I believe VR is a place to explore those ideas. My fourth law of VR is it's got to be the ultimate safe space for the exploration of all ideas of the human imagination, including the dangerous ones. There's some very interesting things happening in other areas of the world where there's a different sort of regulation framework. In Scandinavia, they're doing work with pedophiles in VR because there's a certain percentage of the population that has this pedophilic hunting instinct, and that's just it's a genetic thing. And so they're measuring, and of course this pushes every button of our culture and every button of most cultures. But this is by having VR, they're able to do things they could never do in any other kind of research environment. So it's got to be an ultimate safe space, because then we can explore all these different healing modalities and find new ways to engage humans all the way besides war.
Not sweeping things under the rug.
Yeah.
So you talk about safe space, and I agree. VR can be very powerful. If our whole body is represented in VR, what kind of fail-safes could we put in place to prevent us from getting trapped inside of it, or essentially some kind of like mind prison?
What's wrong with mind prison? You don't
Come
like
to my mind
prison? What's wrong
prison.
with you?
I'm actually, there's a concept like that in the futurists that I tell cautionary tales, okay? I mean, you know, the ironic part of this time for me is, you know, Palmer walks up to me, man, your movie was an inspiration to me. I said, you do remember it was a cautionary tale, right? Do you remember what happened at the end? Okay. You know,
That was
of course,
intense.
when you create cautionary tales, it glamorizes the very thing you're spending caution on. So I'm going to continue to tell cautionary tales at the same time as I glamorize this medium, because I think it's a very wonderful, amazing, techno-glamorous thing, and I love that aspect of it too. So, but we have to continue to explore these ideas. I mean, I was just at this gathering of people. I was asked to talk about VR in a gathering in Washington, D.C., with a group of people from the alphabet soup of agencies, and it was one of the more interesting and crazy experiences of my life, because there's DARPA, DOD, DITRA, CIA, NSA, Homeland Security, were all there in this mansion in Chevy Chase, and it was like, why are they here talking to me? Was the question. And so what it turns out is that there is a lot of people involved at that level of government that really want to see these things pushed in a positive direction. And that was a completely blow-mind experience for me. I felt like I was in, you know, passing a joint in a party in Northern California with a bunch of Crystal Twisties, and yet they were running the secret government. They were very highly placed people, and so there's places. This medium is really getting out there, and people are very aware of it. Now there's the dark DARPA. These guys have talked about the dark DARPA, and dark DARPA is looking at using VR as torture. Just exactly what you're talking about.
And we've seen some torture simulators from Sony published already at this point in terms of a horror game, and it's pretty graphic.
Yeah.
So it's definitely possible.
And I just think, you know, that going back to that experience of the gun on the table, these genres, I mean, I love all genres of film. I mean, the horror genre, I made several horror films. I mean, I love it all. It's all great. But the genres take on a different quality when it's in an immersive, interactive environment. It just does. And we have to be very aware of that.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned ethics, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. So right now in physical reality, we have legal systems and structures in place that help maintain order in our society. How does any of that work in a virtual world where I can throw virtual babies off of virtual roofs all day long, where anything can happen? So are we going to have to reinvent ethics for virtual reality?
I think it actually might save us from having to do that, because the whole nature of virtual reality is that it's your reality. Do whatever you want. And so I think there will be, you know, mechanisms will emerge that allow us to protect ourselves from people who are fond of virtual realities that we don't like. But ultimately it will allow for you know, each and every person, if they so desire, to have their very own universe with their very own ethics and rules and laws, and in order to enter that world, you have to agree to those things, or actually, it will be much easier to enforce those things. They can just be, you know, it's not like you'll be able to break the law because it's coded into the reality.
I don't know if this is coming later, but that just sort of touches to me on how we're set up right now is becoming so centralized that we're having to make such harsh decisions about each person's set of their own personal rules. And, you know, this idea that we're basically sort of throwing away huge pieces of who we are because everything's going through this central server that has to appease a mass of people. And with virtual reality, in order to exist in all these worlds, we need to change the way that we've built up our web, which is not a web at all, and then have the choices to go through those portals and have that code exist for those set of rules, which is really, you know, personal beliefs. When you have all of this information going through a few servers where this company, say Google, Facebook, whatever, has to decide the moral compass of everyone, you're taking away everyone's choice. And then we're sweeping things like, you know, horrible things like pedophilia and things under the rug. We're not dealing with them or confronting them. And this is not the way that we kind of can exist in our virtual world going forward. If we're going to have our own places that we can, exist in a way that we want to exist, then we can't exist on sort of HTTP or this sort of like single source siphon of information.
Yeah, I just think that as long as these experiences, from the very beginning, we make them social, we make them interconnected with others, so there can be an aspect to it. If it's something that's where you're completely alienated and totally siloed in your own little world all the time, that I think is a dangerous way for us to go. And the social aspects of this, which I see, advancing pretty quickly, I think are some of the greater, because there'll be a natural governance of community that takes place that can actually happen without these crazy structures of government that we've had for, we're watching ours right now dissolve. It's the end of this experiment. So something new is coming. And what's going to happen when we're having a presidential campaign in virtual reality? Because 4 years from now, we will be. And that is something we have to, I think there's going to be a greater expansiveness in the way in which systems become self-governing with humans, because the group mind is way more intelligent than we give it credit for. And if we can focus VR in this interconnectedness fashion, in this direction, I think it could be one of the most powerful things ever. And it's what I call the interconnectedness of the global human, because I don't like citizens. Citizens is like you're beholden to some rule book, but we're all humans, and we live on this globe. And this idea comes actually from Joseph Campbell. I got it from him in a hot tub in Iceland, actually, 36 years ago. And it turns out that that's completely focusing my direction in VR. Because he told me, I asked him, I'd never done anything that I actually snuck in with my girlfriend into Esalen, and I said, what, he was doing a residency there, it was the last 5 years of his life, and it was like, what's the myth I gotta follow, as a young, stupid dude, and he said, the myth of the global human, where the interconnectivity, the understanding that it isn't about nation states, it isn't about all of these even cultural rules. Yes, we can explore and enjoy all that, but if we don't bond together as global humans, we're not going to have humans. And he said that, Joseph Campbell. So I'm thinking this medium has to be the medium of the global human.
Yes, and it's interesting because in talking about how everyone could have their own personal reality, at the same time, I think that sort of makes it implicit that the boundaries would dissolve. So it's just, it's like, but this
don't we all want boundaries to dissolve? Isn't that a human instinct? Don't we want to get as close as we can with other people? Don't we want to, get beyond the fleshy cages? I mean, it's such an instinctual drive in being human that when we're able to start to experience that at a greater and greater visceral level in VR, it's going to be completely the focus of the whole thing. I'm not talking about just sexuality. I'm talking about, all forms of communing with others.
Well,
that's something.
Transcendent as that might be, there's equally going to be distractions. So
it's going to be a mess.
If you talk about spaces where you can do anything you want, I mean, there's still the classical ethics paradoxes where if you, I think all of us agree in freedom. I think that's a very powerful ideal that all humans desire. At the same time, governments and nation states are always going to try to be protecting an ethical ideal in some fashion, as well as other human beings. The trick is to do it without it being a top-down organization. So you talk about social interconnectivity. Part of social interconnectivity is that everyone you socialize with observes you. And you essentially have a morality meter floating above your head. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone literally sees a morality meter, but you effectively have one. Now, if you're in an isolated VR space and you have no connection with anyone and don't have to, and there's no rating system imposed on you, you can do atrocious acts that would be very unhealthy that I don't think anyone would consider is a wise choice for any human being. And so having a space where you're, misguided individuals are able to do those things, certainly can't be considered a good thing to allow. Right. But at the same time, I can't say, oh, then we need to have a government come in and enforce it, because that's removing freedom. So we have to figure out a solution that
freedom is messy.
You have to have something that, like you talk about the global human connectedness. Well, what does global human connectedness give you in terms of checks and balances? Well, it gives you observation. You're essentially in a giant panopticon where everyone is observing everyone else, but no one's surveilling you because there is no authority. Right. It's merely social influence.
I think, sorry if I'm...
No, go ahead.
I think a huge thing, like, for me, the biggest word that's been coming up in the work we're doing lately is trust. And how do you create trust? And in our current environment, I think everybody feels that lately with this technology. This has been a huge sort of, we're in a dark time in that we're sort of every day connected to this device, but we don't know fully the intentions and workings of it. We don't know, it's all going through a central thing. It's not, you look at like the Egyptian government shutting down the entire internet, and then you realize your entire way of communicating and all of this trust that you built up with this thing in your hand is betrayed you. And then you have to all of a sudden find a way to rebuild that for yourself. And then I think we probably have, I grew up with no electricity, so the reliance on these kind of things, most people haven't had interruptions in them. They haven't had any big sort of blackout of this information that has become a part of us. And that is something to really start thinking about right now. And that was one of the main reasons I really wanted to be on this panel, is because if you don't start thinking about how you have access to your information, how you can share information with somebody else sitting right next to you, the fact that in order for you to talk to him, you'd have to go through something that you have zero control over, is kind of terrifying. And I think that we need to, the web and how it's been built has brought us all sorts of amazing things. We're here right now talking about these things, but we've outgrown it, and we're in this really uncomfortable phase right now, I think, where you see governments doing all sorts, this media machine that just seems like utter garbage, constantly getting flung at you, and people seem so stupid, but you're like a part of all these people that you think are also stupid, and it's like, how do we get that trust back in each other? And it's like, I think the only way you can get that trust back is by it being like a peer-to-peer blockchain web, where
Yay.
Yeah, like it has to change to being like the amount of trust you have.
Money too.
Yeah, money, everything has to. We have to change the entire protocol for how we are connected right now.
So no one should own anything.
No money. The whole idea of currency is a real bad virus.
It's a set of trust. It's a set of values that we agree on.
You're talking about like a post-scarcity society that has no need for value exchange?
Speaking of post-scarcity, one of the things that came out of this DC trip, what I'll just share with you, which is connected to a VR project that I'm now involved in because of this. Some of the people there were involved with cold fusion. And if you look into the recent press just of the last couple of weeks, there's now been a few very high-profile lawsuits that have been put down around the patents of cold fusion, which means it's real. As soon as the lawsuits happen, it starts to move into it's the bellwether of like, okay, it's happening. It is happening. It's happening up at Stanford. It's not just Rossi, who's kind of a empirically messy scientist, so he was able to, he got a lot of criticism. It's a number of things, and I've now verified that it is actually happening. And so with this group, we're creating a VR game, because using the medium of VR, because it's, again, more expansive, that the end goal of the game is you're creating your own cold fusion reactor. And that sounds nuts, right? But that's something that I think is really right around the corner. And the key in the game is how it disrupts everything. It takes the idea of scarcity of energy away, and that means a massive global shift towards what you're talking about. These kinds of core things are going to start erupting simultaneously as this medium is erupting. that are going to connect together to allow and create something that's truly not just revolutionary but evolutionary. And that's the exciting thing happening right now. I think that VR is a component of this whole other thing happening in the morphogenetic field that's going to, those dots are going to be connected probably faster than we imagine. And I'm also excited to tell stories about it.
So if you're saying if you have a post-scarcity society with free energy, which is what cold fusion provides, you can have a environment that is both communist in the sense that you don't need value exchange and everyone gets equal opportunity and equal everything. However, you also have complete laissez-faire market because there's no need for competition anymore. You can infinite output. People can create products as much as they want, but you don't even need to sell them. You could have them on demand whenever you want.
Yeah, we've been trying this other thing for a while. Let's try something new.
Could it be capitalism and socialism, the best of both worlds?
Yeah, I don't think it's a system that we could say it's that or that.
You can't really
pin
anything on there, can you?
I think, like, if you think about the fact that, billions of people have still never touched a computer on the planet, and that they will probably never see a laptop, a lot of people, because we have smart computers in our hands, selling $5 smartphones in India, and we'll have everything as an interface. So what happens when you throw away all of my preconceived notions of how technology should evolve, the fact that I played the Oregon Trail and that things should work this way and that I should be hunched over thing, and then you give somebody with a fresh mind, you drop off of a virtual university in the middle of nowhere, and they're able to actually learn and interact in this environment that we can only just barely start to wrap our heads around now. What happens when those people who haven't had information controlled and sort of fed to them in this certain way can literally achieve and imagine anything? I think you're going to see a giant, giant shift, because we are stuck on this. We've chugged along with our progress, and we're hardwired that way. We're hardwired in this linear way, but technology isn't linear. So when you drop off the rest of the world with infinite information, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I would like to sort of skip over all the turmoil and difficult transitions that we're facing, just to consider the thing of, like, if we get to this post-scarcity situation and we're all immortal, everyone can do anything they can imagine, there is no conflict whatsoever, the question arises is, well, what remains as a meaningful endeavor for humanity? And the only thing is art and entertainment and creativity, and I think that's significant. I think we should be thinking about that now, because that's all that we will have left. There will be no more struggling to survive or to make products that make your life better or whatever. It comes down to art and entertainment.
The only
and
currency is
self-expression.
experience.
Just poetry and music and all the forms of entertainment.
Some of the things I've been looking at as because I'm trying to figure out this whole area of interactive, immersive, narrative environments. There's no even languaging for it really, and I realized that the current mediums and the modern mediums and cinema, it has very little to do with this. As a matter of fact, it's the antithesis of it in many ways. So I've been looking backwards and experiencing and looking at tribal ritual and the structural aspects of tribal ritual as antecedents for virtual guidance and narrative in a virtual narrative environment that's interactive. And I was in the middle of this ceremony with Aborigines in Australia. They call corroboree, and corroboree is a multi-clan celebration and ritual. And the Aborigines of Australia are the only people on Earth that didn't have war for 50,000 years. It's almost completely unique. And one of the reasons they didn't is they had this ritual that allowed, there were 5,000 different clans, 5,000 dialects, all kinds of differences. But they had this ability to come together and exacerbate the energy of war in a different way. And so looking at the tenets of interactive narrative, I'm looking back to ancient forms more than I'm looking to modern forms, and it's a very interesting exploration.
Yeah, I think ritual falls into that. I state it as art and entertainment because that's how I think of it. But I think of ritual as being incorporated into those things, and that art is a ritual, and so I think ritual is going to be significant as well because it's a meaningful endeavor.
It's a self-expression.
It's self-expression. It has nothing to do with survival or scarcity or
right.
the
So
other issues.
the whole idea, which I found what you're talking about is just it's really eye-opening the way you phrased it. How we need to think right now. We're in a transition in terms of our culture globally right now, where we need to start prioritizing self-expression over survival.
Exactly.
Because we don't need to worry about surviving anymore.
Exactly.
But wars still exist, and all this awful shit still exists. But why? And even more so in the future, why would it continue to persist? So by preparing now and prioritizing that and not thinking about arts and entertainment as something that's ancillary or unnecessary or frivolous.
Something you do in your free time.
It's quite the opposite. It's the foundation of human experience.
Everything is free time. That's as a matter of fact, empowering people to create and creating modalities for empowering humans to create is going to be the killer app of this entire medium. Anything that does that will, I think, gain tremendous traction.
I was just at the Gray Area. They did a neural network Google Deep Dream art show. And it was kind of interesting because each time the computer deep dreams, you're teaching a computer how to hallucinate, it's an original piece of work. And there's a lot of people debating over what is this really art? I mean, as people do all through time. But it's, for me, was the most approachable way to understand a neural network. I mean, I don't come from a computing background. I've been a touring DJ for 10 years. And when you say this isn't for this protocol for us to, be able to get somebody here and do this thing, it's just like, I don't know, we're gonna let a computer do acid and see what happens. And then that's cool. And then you start to sort of have this totally open mind frame, just like you do when you go to an art gallery. I don't know, what do you think about this? And instead of trying to control a computer to do a certain thing for a specific task, you start to let it be free and think like you do. It's gonna come up with some amazing things you never thought of. And this is how we start to get, bigger ideas, is by letting, a computer play in the same way you let a kid play. And then observing that and trying to connect with that.
Is it okay if we touch on Google Deep Dream for a second? Because that is really fantastic stuff. Who here has played with Google Deep Dream? Okay, we got a few people. So most of us don't know what it is. Do you think you could explain just briefly what it is and the algorithm a little bit?
Certainly. So most computers are serial, and the easiest way I think to explain it, it's better to look at it because
go check it out. It's online.
Maybe
just type
if
in
you've
Google Deep Dream.
It'll be a lot easier to understand if maybe you've done a hallucinogen or two in your life.
That too.
But you ask a computer to you give a computer an image, say, so a high resolution image, and you want to downgrade that. So you want to take it from a high sample rate down to a low sample rate. And normally with a serial computer, it's going to have to decide on every edge and be like, is this a yes or a no? And then it'll become pixelated. But when you use a serial computer, which works more like a neuron, has multiple options and multiple paths it can take, and then you feed it a styling image. And so in a lot of the first ones they did, they fed it hundreds of pictures of animals in nature and bugs.
Like the dogs thing, wasn't it?
The dogs,
dogs
lots
kept
of
appearing up everywhere.
And then as it's downsampling the original image, instead of it trying to pixelate, is this a piece of hair or a piece of wall? Is this a dog or a cat or a bug or a thing? And it's trying to imagine, as you're taking away the samples and the pixels of this one image, it's trying to imagine how it can keep the framework of that one image with these hundreds or however you're.
It just has a giant data bank of
just
images.
has and so then all of a sudden you have you're like, well, that looks like Cosmo, but he's got a weird dog nose, and there's a spider web behind him.
But what's crazy is our human brain has that data bank in our brain.
Exactly.
We have a data bank of hundreds of millions of impressions of things and objects and dogs and cats and fish bowls and bugs. And so when you trip out It's your brain doing this process.
It's the exact same
of
thing.
you can
It's
probably
a
speak
neural
to this.
network. We are a neural network. Our brain is a neural network. It
Right.
functions in the same way, and it's just emulating the effect that we have of pareidolia when we look at clouds or
Pareidolia,
wood grain
yeah.
and we see faces and animals and shapes. Well, a neural network simulated on a computer can do the same thing. And
Right,
so,
right.
And it's
It's
interesting
pretty
because
amazing.
you bring up the thing, is it art or not? And I think that sort of gets back to the idea of like, well, can a computer be conscious? Can we create conscious computers? And it's such a kind of a silly argument in a sense, because it's quickly being revealed that, well, of course it can be conscious. It is conscious because everything is consciousness. Everything, these chairs, the floor, it's all conscious. So, it's different forms of consciousness.
Right.
So you believe in panpsychism?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be self-aware consciousness, right? But there's a certain level there's different degrees of consciousness. Of course, that's getting into some
Yeah.
pretty deep
Yes,
stuff.
but no one can prove that the floor is not self-aware.
This is true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
So-
it's the bodhisattva concept. It's, basically goes to all of those thoughts. It really is.
Watch your step.
Everything must become awake in order for any of us to get out of this thing.
We have about 10 minutes left. I want to get more into artificial intelligence. I have a few questions about that. I think it's really fascinating, really exciting new technology that is starting to seep its way into all aspects of our life. As AI gets better and better, it'll become very difficult to distinguish between a human and an AI. So should there be safeguards put in place to make it easier to determine if you're talking to an AI or an actual person? Will it even matter? Could we ever have friends that are artificial intelligence?
It's happening already.
Yeah.
I mean, that's happening.
Yeah, it's going to dissolve.
I mean, you've heard about there's a whole generation, subset of men in Japan that are having relationships with an automated, not very advanced AI, but an automated woman. And they take them out on dates. Their friends get to know them. There's this is a big trend going on right now.
There's also those like
and
creepy
it's
doll
accepted.
kids who like the elderly people get, so they're not lonely anymore. Have you
Exactly.
seen those?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
there's people in Southern California with dogs.
There's some AI for you.
Yeah, and it's very, it's been in the literature for decades. This whole notion that we have, that the boundaries dissolve. That as AI is becoming more advanced and will quickly surpass us in its capabilities and intelligence, we will be changing too and incorporating that same technology into ourselves. And so it's not a question of us and them. The boundaries between us and them will dissolve
It's
as
all
they
us.
form.
It's all us. It's coming from us. It's not.
But
This idea. It's not falling from outer space.
Yeah.
It's.
Is there a way to know that dissolving isn't just subjective? I mean, if we're talking about human consciousness being something that, having this self-awareness is something only really humans have, and that's something we have observed. Yes, the wall or the floor might have some consciousness, but we can tell that we're self-aware in ways that other things aren't. Can that self-awareness be created artificially, or is it a law of the universe that it's impossible to create truly self-aware consciousness and that we are the only ones?
I think that one of the things that I'm very interested in interactive storytelling,
Even if it looks like it's a real thing.
is exploring exactly that in the context of interactive storytelling, because I don't think it's going to be something that just, again, we figure out and it's there.
Right.
It's going to be a process of interaction that takes place over a period of time, and there'll suddenly be these epiphany points where it'll be, suddenly this thing will happen that will show us that there is a kind of self-awareness. I think one of the things I'm working with is the connection of eye interaction technology with AI character behavior. And this is some creepy shit, let me tell you. But it's really fun. So the eye interaction technology right now, it's almost reads your mind. I mean, it's very, very clear. And so then you take that data and give it to an AI character that has
Talking about how eyes look in an avatar, or how?
No. This is reading our eyes, and it's there's a company I'm working with called iFluence that has one of the more advanced things, and it's not just eye tracking, because they've got that down to miniaturization, but it's eye interaction software that is not just reading like you have to blink or focus. It literally reads all these subtle cues, moves, iris contraction, all these things that give it the context of intent. And so when you have an AI character starting to understand the intent of humans in a virtual space, now you're getting to true interactive storytelling, because it's not storytelling, it's story worlding, actually, is what it really is. And the core of it, I think, will be, we will find empathy. We'll find empathy with artificial characters that then reflects back empathy to ourselves. And that empathy engine is something that I think is going to be at the core of this idea of true interactive narrative. And
I wanted to ask you about the eye. It's interesting to me that you brought up the eyes and how we're studying our eyes, but that's, to me, the biggest disconnect with any kind of AI is when you look in someone's eyes. And it was one of the things we were touching on with the neural networks, is taking, pictures of people's eyes from every angle, super up close, and then using, the avatar is the scanned-in avatar, using like the bone structure and everything, how it interacts. Yet the eye itself would run off a neural network that is based on learning human emotion, and that itself looks like an eye. They're just taking really high-resolution pictures of every kind of interaction. It's like, that to me it's something so simple that you may not really think about, but as soon as you scan your face in, you're like, cool, I look like a dead digital zombie.
Right,
Yeah. And
some people think that's really cool. A lot of people at these VR conferences do. Woo. Intimacy. It really is about intimacy. Getting to a medium that this neural network that we are reaches out and creates intimacy with other forms of ourself, other AI forms, and each other. That's, I think, what this medium's all about.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out again, just to put it out there, just to propose the idea that this self-awareness thing, maybe it's kind of a red herring in a way, because I don't know, many of us have had the experience of having complete communion and communication and connection with inanimate objects, with the sky, with plants, with dead things, with inanimate objects. And so that could well be a complete crazy hallucination, but it might also be that maybe that's the actual reality underlying our condition, and that we just can't see it. We just can't normally, because of our hard wiring and our evolution to be focused on only things that are relevant to survival, we filter out this connection to virtually everything, that everything is self-aware.
Well, when you do ayahuasca, that's definitely what happens.
Yeah, I mean, psychedelics definitely help with that.
Well,
DMT.
It's interesting, like
when LSD 25, it's all good shit.
Yeah, well, that's a topic for a whole nother panel. I would say
we're tripping right now.
Everybody is.
We're meeting out there.
Don't drink the water. But yeah, I mean, this is a really good point. I mean, when you think about sentimental value and you think about falling in love with inanimate objects, why do people have such an attachment to gold and jewelry? Why do we take a souvenir home from a vacation? Why do we love the beach and love the mountains and in nature? Why do we not want to change the way our room looks? Or why do we want to change the way our room looks? Well, all of these things are related to complete inanimate objects that have anything to do with humans. So that's a very valid point you bring up.
I mean, I think it's a parallel. Like, everything that we can't see is in parallel to what we, in this moment, at this state of our consciousness, can see. That's not to say that, there's a whole bunch of other things going on.
I think to bring it back to VR is a thing where we can bring a lot of people into these kinds of experiences that haven't done these psychoactive substances or have the lifestyles that we may have been able to live. And it's an egalitarian medium that in order to create transformative experience, an egalitarian medium, that is fucking radical for this planet.
Well, that's what, my whole effort is dedicated to with Shapespace is creating an experience that is safe, that is, effective for whoever, and isn't culturally biased in any sense. It's completely abstract, and yet it allows you to connect and commune with entities that don't even exist.
Like, can we talk a little bit about virtual drugs?
No. I think it's time for a Q&A.
Someone ask about virtual drugs, please.
No, actually, that is really that sounds fascinating. I would love to talk about that. But it is in fact an hour, and I would love to open up the discussion to you.